Hello. This week I was due to be at St Mary's Goldington, and that's because normally this weekend the curates would have been ordained down in the Abbey in St Albans, and they would be supported by their incumbents. But like many things this year, it's not happening as normal. Marcus will be licensed in a slightly different way, and we pray for him as he starts the next phase of his ministry at St Mary's. In our Gospel reading, we hear the disciples about to begin the next stage of their ministry. Matthew chapter 10 is sometimes known as the missionary discourse, one of 5 in Matthew's Gospel. And if you remember, we've heard over the previous weeks how the disciples have been called and how they've been prepared for the ministry in front of them. They've been told it might not always be straightforward. They've been told that they may sometimes be rejected. They've been told that sometimes what they say and do will bring division, but they are to persevere. And in these last 3 verses of Matthew chapter 10, we have the disciples being sent out. It's in effect their own Great Commission that we read of at the end of Matthew's Gospel, where he says, "Go and make disciples," or actually, "as you go, disciple." But in these verses, Matthew, who writes, we think, to largely a Jewish audience, uses an image that they would have been familiar with, and that's one of a shaliah, or an emissary. And he sends them out as his emissaries. We sometimes translate that word as apostle, but we also miss, or can miss, the full meaning of the word apostle. Because an emissary is somebody who has the full authority of the person they represent. They are far more than just a messenger of a particular piece of news. They are representing the people who has sent them. And Jesus makes it clear as he sends out the disciples, they are representing him and they have his authority. And that's something that the readers and the hearers would have understood. It is more than just being a messenger. And Jesus says, therefore, if the people reject the disciples, so they reject him. But not only him, because Christ comes and he is the emissary from God. And as the people, if they reject the disciples, they reject Jesus and they reject God. But if they accept the disciples, so they accept Jesus, and through him the relationship with God, which is on offer for all. Matthew then uses another image which would have been familiar to the readers. He speaks about the prophets and the righteous. Now, if that had been in the Old Testament, it may well have been the law and the prophets. And in some ways, this little passage pre-echoes what we see in the Transfiguration, which comes a few chapters later. But he says to the people that as they receive the disciples, they are receiving them as those who are righteous, those who are part of the new covenant relationship with God through Jesus, because those who were under the law were under the old covenant relationship. The disciples and all that accept him are part of that new covenant relationship. And as he speaks to them, it makes it clear that there are 3 elements to that. There is the being piece, there is the speaking piece, and there is the doing piece. Jesus, as he sends the disciples out, calls them to live as people of that new covenant, that their lives reflect that new relationship that they have with God through Christ. He speaks to them about being prophets, not as people who would foretell the future, but actually as people who would speak God's word into a particular situation. Those who would speak of their faith and of what Christ has done for them. But he also says that part of being an emissary of Christ is the doing piece. And that's not necessarily very complicated. It could be as simple as offering a glass of water, as it says in the Gospel reading, to somebody in need. It could be as simple as making a telephone call to somebody who we haven't seen for a while, or perhaps dropping them a card, reaching out with a hand of kindness to a friend, or perhaps an act of random kindness to somebody who we see in need. And as we do that as Christ's emissaries, not because we feel a great sense of injustice or were compelled to do it, or we would feel a sense of guilt if we did not. We do it because it is nothing less than Jesus Christ himself would have done for us and for others. And we are called to be his emissaries. It's a huge privilege and an awesome responsibility.